Battle of Towton. What led to the bloodiest day in England? What happens when a teenage king decides to avenge his father's mutilated corpse with 100,000 arrows and a golden axe? Why did England's nobility, 3/4 of it, show up to fight in a snowstorm so brutal it turned the battlefield into a frozen slaughterhouse? And how did one man's late arrival flip the fate of a kingdom on its blood-soaked head? This is not just a battle, it's a reckoning. A civil war turned personal, where kings are made, heads are spiked, and the snow runs red. Let's dive in. It was supposed to be spring. Palm Sunday, no less. A day for peace, palms, and prayers. Instead, Yorkshire greeted the world with a blistering snowstorm, the kind that makes you question whether God had taken a personal dislike to the entire country. On a narrow road north of Pontefract, a Yorkist column trudged through the gale. These were Norfolk's men, or so they claimed, though Norfolk himself was too sick to lead, and possibly too old to remember he had an army. Command had fallen to either Sir John Howard or Walter Blount, depending on which frostbitten soldier you asked. The men were wrapped in winter clothes they hadn't expected to need, their bows unstrung, halberds slung, and hands so cold they'd have traded their souls for a second pair of gloves. Their numbers? A mystery. Some whispered they were a few hundred. Others swore they were 10,000. Their destination? Also unclear. But one thing was certain, they were marching toward something, and they were ready to fight. As they approached Ferrybridge, the signs of battle were unmistakable. Bodies lay stacked like firewood, the aftermath of a confused skirmish for the bridge. But the Yorkists now held the crossing, a good omen perhaps. The enemy might be retreating or regrouping, or just really bad at bridge defense. Up the old London road, the column hugged the tree line, ascending a ridge. Officers barked orders, horses snorted, snow lashed their faces. And then, a rumble. Faint but growing, the sound of thousands of men and horses, the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop and your sword hand twitch. As Norfolk's men crested the ridge, they saw it. The battlefield of Towton, a countryside overrun with steel and fury. The Lancastrians were spread across a wide ridge, flanked by woods and bordered by a winding river. The Yorkists, charging from flatter ground, had somehow convinced the enemy to give up the high ground. A tactical blunder so baffling it could only be explained by divine intervention or very bad maps. And then, there he was. In the center of the Yorkist line, Edward, son of the slain Duke of York, newly declared king, stood like a golden statue of vengeance. Towering above his guard, clad in gleaming armor, he swung a war axe like he was clearing hedgerows, Lancastrians scattering before him like frightened pheasants. "Look there and behold your king fight," shouted the officers. The East Anglians stared, and then they roared. If Edward was willing to chop his way to the throne, they'd follow him into hell, or at least into a snowstorm filled with angry northerners. With the battle hanging in the balance, Norfolk's men charged. The snowstorm reached a crescendo, the wind howled like a banshee, and the Norfolkmen slammed into the Lancastrian left flank. What happened next? The snow swallowed it whole. Visibility dropped to zero. All anyone knew was that the wheel had begun to spin, and fate was rolling its dice. To understand Towton, you have to rewind to Christmas 1460, when Richard, Duke of York, tried to claim the throne from Henry VI, a king so mentally unstable he made Hamlet look well-adjusted. York was ambushed at Wakefield, and his head, along with that of his son Edmund, was mounted on spikes above the city walls. A festive decoration, if you were into medieval horror. Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce and French, swept down from Scotland, joining forces with Somerset and Northumberland. Meanwhile, York's surviving son, Edward, avenged his father at Mortimer's Cross, defeating Owen Tudor and witnessing a parhelion, 3 suns rising in the sky. His men took it as a sign. Edward took it as branding. Thus was born the sun and splendor, a celestial logo for a very earthly war. The Yorkists suffered a setback at St. Albans in February 1461, where Henry VI was freed, and Queen Margaret ordered the execution of 2 noble captives, Bonville and Carriel, despite Henry's protests. The Queen's ruthlessness, her foreign birth, and her young son's bloodthirsty reputation made her deeply unpopular in London. Sensing the mood, Margaret retreated north. Edward marched into London on February 26th, and by March 1st, he was proclaimed king. No time for a coronation party. Norfolk and Warwick were already raising troops. Falkenberg, a seasoned warrior, led the northern march, joined by Edward days later. On March 27th, Edward, Warwick, and Falkenberg reached Pontefract. Warwick, never one to forget a grudge, had executed the bastard of Exeter, who had led the mob that killed Warwick's father. Revenge was served cold, like everything else in Yorkshire that week. Now pause for a sec, join the front lines of history and power. Welcome to European Battle, where epic clashes, legendary warriors, and untold stories come alive. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you're not just joining a channel, you're stepping into a world of thrilling battles. From ancient empires to modern warfare, we deliver cinematic storytelling, expert insights, and exclusive content that will leave you breathless. Don't just watch history, live it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a moment of the action. European Battle, where legends clash. Before Wakefield, war still wore a mask of civility. Executions were rare and nobles were often ransomed rather than butchered. But Wakefield changed everything. When Richard, Duke of York, was lured into a trap and killed, his mutilated corpse was paraded through York, crowned mockingly with a paper diadem soaked in blood. His son Edmund, just 17, was cut down while begging for mercy. The message was clear. This was no longer a war of succession. It was a war of annihilation. And Edward, the young heir to York, took that message to heart. He would not be outdone in brutality. If the Lancastrians wanted blood, he'd give them a flood. After his victory at Mortimer's Cross, where a perihelion, 3 suns rising, gave him a celestial stamp of approval, Edward was proclaimed king. But even as he gathered his forces, one absence gnawed at him. The Duke of Norfolk. Old, ill, and unpredictable, Norfolk was a pillar of Yorkist legitimacy. His troops were vital, and his name carried weight. Without him, Edward's claim felt less like a coronation and more like a gamble. Meanwhile, in the city of York, the Lancastrians were cornered. They couldn't retreat. Beyond lay the Scottish marches, and the Scots, having already plundered their fill at St. Albans, had scampered home. Margaret's army, swollen with English levies, was now too big to feed, too proud to flee, and too close to Edward to ignore. With Edward just 30 miles south in Pontefract, Somerset led the Lancastrian host out of York. As they passed the city gates, they saw the rotting heads of York and Edmund, still mounted on spikes. Margaret had ordered spaces cleared for Edward and his commanders, a grisly RSVP to the coming battle. The Queen, Henry VI, and Prince Edward remained behind. Somerset pressed south, reaching Tadcaster, then crossing the river Wharfe to Towton, where he chose his battlefield with the precision of a seasoned tactician. Somerset's chosen ground was a wide ridge, flanked by Renshaw Woods to the east and Castle Hill Wood and the Cock River to the west. It was a natural fortress. The Yorkists would have to charge uphill, and the terrain prevented flanking. It was a textbook choice. If Somerset lost here, it wouldn't be for lack of planning. On the night of March 27th, Somerset sent 500 mounted men forward. They encountered a Yorkist unit repairing the bridge at Ferrybridge. The Lancastrians, led by Barons Clifford and Neville, struck hard. The Yorkist commander, Lord Fitzwalter, was killed in the ambush. The bridge was taken. Warwick, Edward's right-hand man, rode ahead to assess the damage. Edward, still in Pontefract, received the grim news and moved swiftly. The Yorkists counterattacked, pushing Clifford and Neville back. But the bridge became a bottleneck. Edward's men had to funnel through in equal numbers, losing their numerical edge. In a foreshadowing of the carnage to come, 3,000 men died in the fight for a single crossing. Edward ordered Falkenberg to take a company and cross at Castleford, a maneuver that required a long ride through Pontefract, then north along the Roman Ridge Road. It was a logistical nightmare, but it worked. Falkenberg scattered the Lancastrians, allowing Edward to cross. The Yorkists pursued Clifford and Neville, who were cut down in Dinting Dale, just north of Saxton. The Yorkists set up camp in Sherburn and Elmet, with an advanced position in Saxton. The Lancastrians camped on their ridge, watched and waited. Both armies passed a tense night. Edward had suffered heavy losses, was still missing Norfolk, and faced a larger, better-positioned enemy. But he showed no sign of hesitation. Delay would be seen as weakness, and weakness was the disease that had crippled Henry VI. Edward had to be the antithesis of Henry, bold, decisive, and ruthless. The The Lancastrians deployed across their ridge, 1,000 yards wide, enough to stretch their full strength. Edward's army, smaller but determined, began to form up. Fauconberg led the vanguard, 10,000 strong, with Edward behind on the left and Warwick on the right, nursing a leg wound from Ferrybridge. The Lancastrians were led by Somerset in the centre, with Northumberland, Exeter, and the infamous Sir Andrew Trollope commanding the flanks. Trollope, once a Yorkist, had defected before Wakefield and masterminded the ambush that killed Edward's father. Edward had placed a £100 bounty on his head, a fortune in those days. Behind both armies, light cavalry waited, not for glory, but for discipline. These were the prickers, tasked with stabbing deserters back into line. If you ran, you got pricked. If you hesitated, you got pricked. It was medieval HR at its finest. And this wasn't just a battle of commoners. With 4 dukes, 4 earls, and 20 barons present, 3/4 of England's nobility were on the field. It was a civil war of kings and crowns, fought not in courts but in mud, snow, and blood. It was Palm Sunday, 1461, and the Lancastrians had every reason to feel smug. They had the high ground, the larger army, and the luxury of sleep. Their men were rested, their lines were drawn, and their banners fluttered like arrogant peacocks on the ridge of Towton. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on: the weather. And Fauconberg, Edward's seasoned commander, was about to turn that snowstorm into a weapon. Fauconberg looked up at the sky, dark, swirling, and blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrians. He grinned. This was no ordinary wind. This was a divine tailwind, and he filled his vanguard with archers. The Yorkists loosed single, precise volleys, then withdrew just enough to stay out of reach. The Lancastrians fired back, but their arrows, fighting against the wind, fell short, like insults shouted into a hurricane. Then Fauconberg unleashed hell. With 20,000 archers, each firing 7 to 12 arrows a minute, the sky turned black. 100,000 arrows per minute hissed through the air like a swarm of hornets, invisible until they struck. And when they struck, they shattered bone, pierced armor, and sowed chaos. The Lancastrians were dying in droves, their own arrows useless, their rage mounting. And when their supply ran low, the Yorkists simply picked up the fallen shafts and fired them back. Fauconberg, ever the tactician, ordered his men to leave half the arrows on the ground, not out of mercy, but to create a spiky minefield for the inevitable charge. The Lancastrians had a choice: stay and be slaughtered, or abandon the high ground. Somerset chose the latter. Their archers withdrew, and their infantry surged forward, armed with halberds, spears, and poleaxes. Both sides knew what was coming. No quarter would be given. Capture meant death. Mercy was off the table. Edward, golden and grim, addressed his men. "Any man who does not wish to fight may leave, but I will stand with those who stay." Then he raised his axe and placed himself in the front line. Somerset flew the royal standard of Henry VI, but he could not match Edward's presence. And when the two armies met at the foot of the ridge, it was not war, it was slaughter. There was no finesse, no elegant maneuvering, just thousands of men trying to kill each other before they themselves were killed. Armor varied wildly, from peasants in padded jackets to knights in foreign-forged plate. But the weapons were all equally cruel. Maces, hammers, axes, tools designed to shatter skulls, break jaws, and snap limbs. The battle didn't pause. It didn't ebb. It was a constant, grinding dogfight, with men throwing themselves forward as their comrades fell, driven by revenge, rage, and desperation. Both sides had suffered. Both had pillaged. Both had lost homes and families. This was payback, and it was personal. Hours into the fight, the Yorkist right began to falter. Edward rushed to reinforce it, his presence lifting spirits. But then came the nightmare. From Castle Hill Wood, hundreds of mounted Lancastrians burst forth, slamming into the Yorkist left. It was the same tactic that had killed Edward's father and brother at Wakefield. Edward was now isolated, his army outnumbered, and the enemy looked ready to surround them. But Fauconberg's earlier maneuver had kept the Yorkists lower on the ridge, and the cavalry hit their flank, not their rear. It was a narrow escape, but they were still in dire straits. Then, through the snow, figures appeared on the far right. Dim at first, then clearer, then unmistakable. Norfolk's men, thousands of fresh troops streaming in from the same road the Yorkists had taken that morning. Yorkist cheers erupted, and with renewed strength, they pushed the Lancastrians back. The Lancastrian lines began to crack. First a few deserters, then entire companies. The flag of Henry VI fluttered alone as the leadership fled. Edward, still fighting like a golden whirlwind, led the charge. The Lancastrians broke and ran. The Yorkists unleashed their light cavalry. The prickers chased down the fleeing enemy, cutting them down or driving them into the river Cock and the wharf, where many drowned in the freezing waters. The field was red with blood. Northumberland and Trollope were killed. Somerset fled, joining Henry VI, Margaret, and Prince Edward as they escaped to Scotland. The next day, Edward entered York. The heads of his father and brother were removed from the gates, replaced with those of his enemies. The Wars of the Roses were far from over. But after possibly the largest battle ever fought on English soil, England had a new king, one who was everything Henry VI was not. Bold, ruthless, and victorious. The field where it happened would be remembered forever as Towton's Bloody Meadow. Next up, the Battle of Bosworth Field. If you thought Towton was brutal, wait till you see what happens when Richard III meets Henry Tudor. Don't forget to follow, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss another blood-soaked chapter of England's most epic saga.